Thank you for staying with us. Now, outgoing NDPP advocate Shamila Batohi says she leaves the National Prosecuting Authority stronger, more independent and more reliable than it was 7 years ago. To unpack this, we're joined by three voices with stature and expertise to go beyond sound bites. Judge Johann Kriegler in studio, former Justice of the Constitutional Court, Abigail Ngobene, legal expert from AG Ngobene Inc, and Dr. Jean Redpath, senior researcher at the Dullah Omar Institute, University of the Western Cape. This is a conversation about accountability, constitutional independence, prosecutorial effectiveness, and ultimately whether justice is being delivered at the scale and speed South Africans need. Thank you all for joining me. Judge Kriegler, thank you so much. Let me start off with you. Now, when the public says, where are the state capture convictions, is that a constitutional governance failure or an operational performance question in your view?
I think it's an incomplete job that has been done. Failure, I wouldn't say. I would say that the job was bigger than the NPA anticipated and that the public anticipated. It's an enormous job. It's not really been grappled with adequately yet.
So is a problem with Shamila Batohi and her inability to carry out the mandate? Or is it a case of, I mean, she's spoken about the various noises. Some might insinuate that that speaks to the pressures that she would have felt?
I personally believe that the job is beyond a single person. It was beyond somebody to do in 7 years. She could not do it. The incoming NPA head will not be able to do it alone. It will call for contributions from the whole of South African society.
Abigail, IDAC is presented as a signature tenure achievement with a pipeline of enrolled matters, but modest conviction numbers in the reporting period. As a legal practitioner, what would change operationally to improve conversion, case selection, investigation management, and so on? I'm sure you've seen that report that Advocate Shamila Batohi published yesterday.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon to you and good afternoon to my fellow esteemed guest there, Justice Kriegler and Dr. Redpath. Yes, of course, there are a lot of systematic challenges in the operation of the criminal justice system, but you'll understand as well that the functioning of the criminal justice system does not really pins down to only one stakeholders. There are a lot of stakeholders that if they work together properly, we would see the ball rolling. So in terms of whether or not there is any systematic change that needs to happen, we need to look at it holistically, look at how the NPA and the SAPs are working together to bring the matters to court, whether the matters are properly investigated by the SAPs for the NPA to secure conviction. So it is a holistic thing that I think I also agree with Justice Kriegler to say it's a enormous job that not only one person can achieve on their own.
Well, Dr. Redpath, let's talk about the conviction rates in the 24-25 period. And from a measurement perspective, how can high conviction rates coexist with public frustration? Because there's a huge amount of public frustration about high-profile corruption matters. I mean, we've seen very few go through the system and come out on the other end with convictions. And what additional indicators would prevent good headline rates from masking weaknesses?
Yes, I mean, this is an issue on which I have batted heads with the NPA for some time. Conviction rates are only calculated on the cases that reach a verdict. So in essence, the incentive is to only proceed with the matters that you're absolutely sure that you're going to succeed with. And from the conviction rates being at 90% plus, obviously the bar is being set at around a 90% chance of success. What this does is slow everything down because the NPA will only enroll a matter and only proceed to trial with a matter that they're absolutely 90% plus sure that they are going to convict. Now, what this does is it rapidly reduces the number of of cases that go through the system. And we've seen a systematic reduction in the number of serious commercial crime cases in particular going through the system. If you go back to 2005, 2006, the specialized commercial crime component of the NPA used to manage about 1,400 a year. Now we're looking at under 300. So that's an absolutely massive reduction. However, that was accompanied by improved conviction rates. So there needs to be a bit more risk-taking on the part of the NPA, which I know they don't want to do because they don't want to be seen to fail. But there needs to be a realization that what is needed is some good convictions to create the idea that the NPA is capable of doing this, which in turn will encourage plea and sentence agreements, and which in turn will create a greater throughput. At the moment, very few plea and sentence agreements are being concluded, and because people do not believe the NPA, well, accused persons do not believe the NPA has the capacity to convict them, or certainly not within a reasonable amount of time. They feel that they'll have 10, 15 years, even if they are convicted out of being in a convicted state. And in that, they are absolutely correct. Things are taking longer and longer. We've also looked at the durations of how long it takes for matters to go through, and it's getting longer and longer.
Judge, we have to talk about Phala Phala, right? Now, the NPA decided not to prosecute. The decision triggered political pushback and calls for review. Constitutionally, what does review of a prosecutional decision require to remain legitimate and non-political?
I believe it is very largely a matter of transparency and accountability. Decisions such as this in regard to non-prosecution of Phala Phala, the public should know why the decision has been taken. Obviously, there are confidential matters that need not and should not be published, but a credible, acceptable explanation for non-prosecution of cases that elicit a great deal of public unrest is necessary. And I think that the NPA has not been as good in that respect as it should have been.
Abigail, when you look at some of these headlines, right, one says, after 7 years at the helm, Shamila Batohi retires as head prosecutor, leaving behind a divided legacy with acknowledgements of some missteps, but no regrets. So let's talk about those missteps, right? What did she do and not do correctly, or what decisions did she make that she potentially should not have made in her tenure?
It is a difficult and interesting question that you are posing to me. And of course, I've listened to the outgoing NDPP in her address. She says she's leaving the NPA that is more stronger, that is more independent. But of course, you'd remember that at that level, a lot of things stops with her, even though she's not in the ground to execute what prosecutors in regional court, district courts are doing. And of course, where things go wrong, even if it's in the ground, it stops with her on the top. You will have noted in various cases that the courts have lamented on the what I would refer to as the skills deficiencies, or something that you'd refer. I remember in the Omodose trial, the judge there lamented to things that she categorized as an unethical incompetency challenges on the side of prosecutors. So it was not her directly involved in those matters, but because she's the ultimate head, everything stops with her. But of course, I would then say that it will not really as well be well for us not to commend the achievements that the NPA have achieved under her tenure. They are dedicated prosecutors in the regional courts, in the district courts, but they are not high-profile cases, so we are unable to follow them to the T. But of course, to answer your question directly, I would say on the issues of state capture, I I think that they have moved very slowly there. And I think as well, part of the things that happened in the Gambide inquiry is also worrisome. And I'm glad that she uttered words such as she acted emotionally. And I think those are the things that, of course, leaves a bitter sour or rather a bittersweet kind of a legacy when you look at how she behaved in that inquiry.
Dr. Redpath, when you talk about the NPA, one of the key aspects to it, obviously, is independence, and how important that independence is for them to be fully functional, or objectively functional, if you will. Now, according to Advocate Batohi, the NDPP cannot determine their own budget, control spending, set salaries, or decide who to hire and fire, right? Which is why the accounting officer question remains critical. Now, how effective can you be if you're unable to execute any of these things?
Well, that's precisely the argument that our institute has been making for some time, is that in many respects, the National Prosecuting Authority is set up by the legislation to fail. In that, especially in cases involving high-profile people, the legislation provides that all of the top layer of the National Prosecuting Authority is appointed by the president with no process, and only the president can fire those people. So you, as the national director, have the top 14 people under you that you actually have no real control over in the sense of hiring and firing. That's all up to the president. So you don't get to choose those people at all, and you have to work with what you've got. Their terms of office also are longer than your term of office. The NDPP has 10 years. If you are going to turn 65 before the 10 years is up, your term is over. Whereas many of the directors of public prosecutions are appointed when they're relatively young, and they serve until they turn 65. There's no limit on their term. Then, as you've correctly pointed out, there's no proper financial control. And if you want to hire in skills that are missing in a particular case, and I believe the NPA struggled in particular on this, there's a provision in the Act that is Section 38 in terms of which this is possible. However, that has to go through the Minister of Justice and the Director General of Justice, and the amount you can pay them is determined by the Minister of Finance. So this is a very cumbersome process, and we understand that there were many problems with hiring outside counsel, outside specialist skills that you may need to prosecute these serious cases. In addition to that, until the establishment of the Investigating Directorate Against Corruption, there was no investigative capacity in the NPA. So you're relying entirely on the South African Police Service and the hawks within the South African Police Service to investigate matters. When the IDAC was initially created temporarily, they had only 35 people. And we heard Advocate Herman Cronje talk about her frustrations of getting even accommodation, even telephones, even the tools of the trade to do the job. And it was only in 2024, August 2024, that the Investigating Directorate Against Corruption became a permanent structure. And it was only a little while later that the number of people employed there exceeded 100. So for much of her term of office, there was no investigative capacity within the NPA, which is what you need if you are doing a high-profile case where you know that someone is guilty, but you need to build the actual case. And that is what the situation is, where we have prima facie evidence, but now you have to firm it up and ensure that it's beyond reasonable doubt in a court.
Well, a question I'd like to ask all three of you, starting with Judge Kriegler, and that speaks to the high-profile cases that we witnessed and which the NPA is accused of bungling, right? So one of the speakers has talked about Shamila Batohi comes in, but she has these public prosecutors whom she doesn't hire or has no capacity to fire, so she has to work with what she's got, right? Now, there's a Gupta's failed extradition, right? The NPA has faced a series of failures in other cases. We talked moments ago about the issue around Timothy Omotoso. We also issue around the extradition of Murwadi Cholota, the former personal assistant of corruption-accused former Free State Premier Ace Magashule. So, your thoughts, Judge, on how much of this lies firmly in the hands of the former NDPP?
I do not think that we can possibly hold the NDPP the liable, responsible, literally. Administratively, yes, she takes the rap in the end. The buck doesn't pass her. But the fact of the matter is, if there were mistakes made, they were made at a level way below her actual personal responsibility. What she has done as a result of the mistakes, that's where I would like to judge her performance. What has she done if there were grave mistakes in the two cases that you mentioned? They're still subject to litigation at the moment, so that the jury is still out. But if indeed those were grave mistakes, I would like to know what steps have been taken to see that it doesn't happen in future.
Sitting with me in studio, Judge Johann Kriegler, as we unpack the tenure of former NDPP Shamila Batohi. Also online, Abigail Ngobene and Dr. Jean Redpath. Very, very interesting conversation. We're coming back to it in a moment. You're watching Newsfeed, the PM edition. Stay with us. Thank you for staying with us. Outgoing NDPP Shamila Batohi hosted the media yesterday on her final day of office, and we are unpacking that with Judge Johann Kriegler, former Justice of the Constitutional Court, Abigail Ngobene, legal expert from AG Ngobene Inc, and Dr. Jean Redpath, senior researcher at the Dullah Omar Institute at the University of the Western Cape. Thank you to all my panelists for staying with us. Abigail, just before the break, the judge took time to walk us through, or at least react to possible failures by Shamila Batohi. More importantly, that much of this can't be lumped on her, even though the buck does stop with her. So would there be any key learnings that should have picked up from some of these failed cases, if you will, failed convictions? You talked about the Omatoso issue, for instance, a few moments ago.
Yeah, I think in most of these cases, going back to the basics would be very important going forward. If you check thoroughly and interrogate the judgment in the Omatoso cases, part of the things was a failure to adequately cross-examine. And that is the ABCs of what an attorney or what a lawyer needs to do in challenging evidence to favor the version of their client. So if at all in that level of a high-profile case, the prosecutors, there is also a statement by the judge said to say it is highly incompetent for a prosecutor who is involved in a rape case not to understand the definition of what rape is. And if we have those kind of findings in that level, we talk to the skills problems within the NPA. So I think it's an area that needs a really intervention. But above that, I think even in the case of Chilota, the extradition, you'd remember that matter was somehow centralized around the Schultz case. But recently, the Constitutional Court declined the NPA a condonation to file a leave to appeal, citing that a 3-month delay compared to the 15 days as afforded by the Constitutional Court rules was unreasonable. So I think it's this ABCs of the rules of court, the skills that is a problem. But perhaps I need to touch on this one as well, as one of the speakers have indicated, the issue of investigating matters. You will note that in most of these high-profile cases, we end up going to trial within a trial, not really dealing with the nitty-gritties and the merits of the case, but conduct of officials, including the sub-officials, on how they handle evidence, on how they investigate cases, which ultimately determine on whether it will be an acquittal or a discharge in terms of say 174, or it is a guilty verdict. And in all that, it reflects bad on the NPA, and as such erode public confidence. So I think it's something that needs to be worked on.
Dr. Redpath, we must touch on gender-based violence, right? And in the Batohi area, reporting highlights expanded survivor support and DNA backlog processing. What outcome measures should accompany these volume figures? Case cycle time, withdrawal rates, conviction quality, survivor experience, to confirm the system is actually delivering justice?
Well, the interesting thing is that sexual offences is actually one of the areas where the NPA does relatively well. So although the conviction rates don't look as good as other cases in terms of how the NPA usually calculates, the throughput rate, in other words, the number of cases that they're successfully doing, has generally been pretty good. And what really is puzzling is in the Omatoso matter, why a prosecutor who was not a specialist sexual offences prosecutor was allocated to the matter. Now that fell under the relevant Director of Public Prosecutions who allocated that matter. He was then removed from the case briefly, but the NDPP allowed herself to be persuaded by the victims that they wanted him back. Now, there was a specialist special offences prosecutor available who would not have made those kind of errors. And so it remains puzzling why that prosecutor was allocated to that matter. We do have excellent sexual offences prosecutors in the NPA who've done a really good job. And if they are allowed to do their job, they do relatively well, even if you compare to international figures. We know that sexual offences are in general very, very difficult to prosecute. They have to rely a lot on the forensics and all of that line, which has to have all the ducks in a row. And it's a very difficult kind of case to prosecute. And in fact, on an international level, the NPA does pretty well on those matters.
Jean Kriegler, my colleague, Johann Redpath, speaking to Advocate Batohi, spoke about one of the few scenarios we've had where the NDPP actually does a handover to the next NDPP. And there's a talk, obviously, of unfinished business, right? Now, the handover narrative flags unfinished work around independence, specialist skills, and digitization dependence. If you had to name the single biggest governance risk to the next NDPP, what would it be and why?
I think it's a pretty presumptuous for an outsider to answer that question, but subject to the qualification that I'm not as well informed as either of the two persons concerned, I would say that I would say to my successor, see to it that you clear up the internal strife within our own ranks as quickly as you possibly can.
Abigail, as we wrap, your final thoughts, hand over what awaits Advocate Matibi.
I think the incoming National Director of Public Prosecution has a duty to restore public trust. I think in many of these high-profile cases, you will agree with me that the occurrences there may have impacted negatively or eroded public trust on the NPA as an institution. So I think the incoming NDPP has a duty to ensure that all the occurrences of events or in discharging his duties in the office, which of course is the mandate of the NPA to prosecute without fear, favor, and prejudice, they have to do that in excellently in order to restore the trust of the public on the institution.
Dr. Redpath, if I ask you to pull out your pen and write the 3 most important things that the new NDPP needs to take care of in the first 100 days, what would those things be?
So I would agree with this previous speaker, an absolute focus on the very important cases that are currently in IDAC and very close monitoring of that. as well as a complete review of the policy, because the policy is what allows the national director to intervene in cases below under the various jurisdictions. And that policy hasn't been changed since 2014. It is completely outdated. It doesn't take into account very changed situations, changed ways of evidence, and it is inadequate. So I would say have a strong look at that policy, amend it. At the moment, it seems to discourage prosecutions. It's very encouraging of not prosecuting. That needs to be looked at. And again, very, very closely, the important cases that everyone is watching, make sure that those go through as quickly as possible and without any problems. And if that requires hiring in additional skills, do it. We need it.
Incredible insights. Big thank you to my guest, Judge Johann Kriegler, former Justice of the Constitutional Court, Abigail Ngobene, legal expert from AG Ngobene Inc, and Dr. Jean Redpath, Senior Researcher at the Dullah Omar Institute at the University of the Western Cape, as we took time to take stock of the last 7 years of Shamila Batohi's tenure as National Director of Public Prosecutions.